The summer of 1843 sat heavy on the land like a wet wool blanket, pressing the breath from every living thing beneath the Mississippi sun. The cotton stood waist-high in the fields of Hargrove Plantation, and the enslaved men and women who moved between the rows moved slowly, deliberately, conserving themselves against the heat, the way desert creatures conserve water. Elias was among them. He was not the oldest man on the plantation, but age had come to him unevenly. It had settled in his eyes while leaving his hands still strong, still capable. His back was a map of his life, a topography of scars that other men on the plantation read the way sailors read coastlines, for warning, for orientation, for proof that something treacherous lay ahead. He had been born into bondage on a plantation in Georgia, sold twice, and had arrived at Hargrove's land at the age of 19. Now he was 36. He had outlived a wife, a child, and 4 overseers, and he had done all of it quietly, which was the only way a man like him was permitted to survive. No one paid particular attention to Elias until the morning he stopped working. It happened without drama, without announcement. One moment he was dragging his cotton sack down a row, and the next he had simply stopped. He stood perfectly still, with his face turned slightly upward, his lips parted, his eyes open, but focused on something that existed behind the visible world. The men and women nearest him noticed first and stepped away instinctively, the way animals step away from lightning before it strikes. Old Bess was the one who touched his arm. "Elias," she whispered it. "Elias, you better move. Caldwell is coming." He did not move. He stood in that strange suspension for another full minute, long enough for the overseer, a lean and sunburned man named Caldwell, to notice the stillness in the field and ride toward it on his gray horse, long enough for the nearby workers to put careful distance between themselves and whatever was happening. When Elias finally blinked and lowered his gaze, Caldwell was already upon him. "What in God's name are you doing?" Caldwell said. Elias looked at him with the calm of a man returning from somewhere far away. "Listening," he said. The word, delivered so plainly, so without apology, confused Caldwell long enough for Elias to add, "To him." He pointed upward. Caldwell beat him for it. That was expected. What wasn't expected was that Elias received the beating the way he had received the stillness in the field. Quietly, with that same expression of a man who has heard something that rearranges all other sound into insignificance. He did not cry out. He did not beg. He simply endured, and when it was done, he returned to his row and resumed picking. And there was something in his bearing that Caldwell couldn't name, and therefore could not punish further. That night, in the quarters, Elias told Bess what he had heard. "He told me the day May is coming," Elias said. They sat on the dirt floor of the small cabin she shared with her daughter and grandson, the fire a low and modest thing, as if it too were being careful. "He told me the chains will break, not just mine, all of them." Bess studied him. She was a woman who had survived by being practical, by rooting her faith through the channels of everyday labor, through the small mercies of food and sleep, and the continued breathing of the people she loved. She did not distrust God. She simply trusted in the way a person trusts a river, aware that it has its own direction and will not be hurried. "What kind of voice?" she asked. "Not a voice like yours or mine," Elias said. "More like, you know when you're half asleep and you hear something and you don't know if it was inside or outside. Like that, but certain, the way thunder is certain. Bess said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You best be careful who you tell." He was not careful. Within 2 weeks, half the enslaved population of Hargrove Plantation had heard the story. It moved from mouth to mouth in the compressed, urgent way that important things move among people who have no newspapers, no letters, no public square. Whispered in the fields, passed in the brief press of bodies at the water trough, spoken in fragments during the hours of relative darkness. The story changed as it traveled, the way all stories change. Some versions were modest. Elias had heard a voice tell him that God had not forgotten them. Other versions were enormous. Elias had been shown a vision of armies, of fire, of the Red Sea parting for a new set of feet. In every version, the core remained. A man had stopped in a cotton field and claimed that God had spoken directly to him. A black man in bondage, a man who owned nothing, not even the hours of his own days. This was the radical part. This was the part that Bess understood was dangerous. It was not the claim of divine speech itself that unsettled the plantation's order. White Christianity had made its peace with visions and prophecy as long as they moved in approved directions, as long as they counseled patience and submission and the deferred justice of a heaven that lay conveniently beyond this life. What Elias was describing was different. He was describing a God who was interested in the affairs of this world, who was watching this specific field, who had something to say about this specific bondage. That was a different God entirely. Word eventually reached the ears of James Hargrove, the plantation's owner. He was a man of 50, educated, a reader of scripture, who kept a well-annotated Bible on his desk alongside his ledger books. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time and place, which is to say, he was capable of terrible things and managed not to see them as terrible. He called Elias to the main house. Elias stood in the study with his hat in his hands. Not because he was nervous, but because it was required. He looked at the bookshelves, the globe in the corner, the painting of Hargrove's father above the fireplace. "I've been told you've been preaching," Hargrove said. "I haven't been preaching," Elias said. "I've only been telling what happened to me." "And what happened to you?" Elias told him. He told him plainly, without embellishment, without the fevered quality that Hargrove had expected and would have found easier to dismiss. When he finished, Hargrove leaned back in his chair and regarded him. "You understand," Hargrove said carefully, "that what you're describing, God speaking to you specifically, to you above others, that is a very large claim." "Yes, sir." "Men have gone mad from smaller claims." "Yes, sir." "And you're not mad?" Elias met his eyes. "No, sir. I don't believe I am." Hargrove dismissed him with a warning that was less severe than Elias had expected. This, too, was something Bess noticed. She noticed that Hargrove had not beaten him, again had not sold him, had not done any of the things the machinery of their world existed to do. She thought she understood why. The certainty in Elias was the kind of thing that, once seen, was difficult to simply erase with violence. Violence could silence a man, but it could not unring a bell. The community of enslaved people on Hargrove Plantation was not unified in its response to Elias. There were those who believed him immediately and completely, for whom his account landed like rain on parched ground. These were people for whom the God of Sunday sermons, filtered through white ministers who preached that servants should obey their masters, had always felt like a borrowed God, a God lent to them with conditions attached. The idea that this God had spoken directly to one of their own, without intermediary, without translation, was not just comforting. It was revolutionary in the deepest sense. It rearranged the fundamental architecture of who mattered. Among this group was a young man named Solomon, barely 20, who had arrived at the plantation only the previous year after being separated from his family in a sale. He attached himself to Elias with the intensity of someone who has found the thing he did not know he was searching for. He began to carry himself differently, with a quiet straightening of the spine that the overseers noticed and did not like. There were also those who were skeptical, and their skepticism was not faithlessness, but a kind of care. The care of people who had learned that hope could be weaponized, that the raised expectation was sometimes the cruelest instrument of despair. An older man called Thomas, who had seen 3 men hanged for lesser provocations than organizing belief, was among these. "What does the voice want you to do?" Thomas asked Elias one evening, sitting on a log outside the quarters as the plantation settled into its brief nightly quiet. "It didn't say what to do," Elias said. "It said what is." "And what is?" "That we are not forgotten, that what's been done to us has been seen." Thomas was quiet for a while. A moth moved around the lantern hanging from the corner post. "That's not nothing," he finally said, "but it's not a plan." "No," Elias agreed, "it's not a plan." This was the honest heart of it. Elias had never claimed to have received instructions. He had never organized a revolt, never spoken of routes north or weapons or coordinated action. What he had received, or claimed to have received, was something more elemental, the reassurance that an eye was on them, that the universe had not looked away, that a record was being kept in some ledger more honest than Hargrove's. This made him both less dangerous and more dangerous than the plantation's white inhabitants could calculate. 3 months after the first episode in the field, it happened again. This time Elias was at the edge of the creek that ran along the property's western border, filling water buckets in the early morning before the main work began. 2 other men were with him, Solomon and a quiet man named Henry, when Elias again became still. This time there were no overseers close by. The 3 of them were alone in the thin morning light, with the sound of the water and the distant calling of birds, and Solomon and Henry watched as Elias stood with the bucket hanging from his hand, water pouring from it unnoticed into the creek, his face raised in that familiar posture of reception. When he came back to himself, Solomon gripped his arm. "What did you hear?" Elias set the bucket down. He sat on the bank of the creek and looked at the water for a while. Then he said, "It said, 'Tell them that the suffering is not the whole of the story.'" Solomon repeated this under his breath. He seemed to be testing its weight. "That's all," Henry said. He was a pragmatic man, a man of specific concerns. "Tell them the suffering isn't the whole story. That's all." Henry picked up his buckets. "My body doesn't need a voice to tell me what I already know," he said, and there was no contempt in it, just the flatness of a man who measured things in pounds and miles and lash counts rather than in revelations. He walked back towards the quarters. Elias watched him go without offense. "Do you believe him?" Solomon asked, meaning Henry. "He's right," Elias said. "His body knows what it knows." "That's true. What I'm saying isn't that his body is wrong. I'm saying there's something his body can't see." Solomon sat beside him on the bank. The morning was already beginning to heat. "Do you think the voice will tell you something useful?" he asked. "Something about when? Or how?" Elias looked at him with something like gentleness. "I think you want a general," he said, "and I'm not that." "Then what are you?" Elias thought about this seriously, the way he seemed to think about everything, as though every question deserved the full weight of his attention. "A witness," he finally said. "I think maybe I'm just a witness." Word spread beyond the plantation. It found its way to neighboring farms, carried by the enslaved people who were occasionally loaned out for work, by the women who took laundry to town, by the networks of communication that existed beneath the visible surface of southern life, like an underground river. And with the wider spreading came wider fear from those with reason to fear it. A minister was brought in, a white minister of the fire and brimstone variety, who preached to the assembled enslaved population on a Sunday morning in the yard. He spoke at length about the sin of pride, about the presumption of claiming special communication with the Almighty, about how Satan himself worked through false prophets and counterfeit visions to lead the unwary into destruction. He looked at Elias several times while he spoke, though he never named him. When the sermon was done, Hargrove had Elias brought forward. He was given a choice: recant or be sold south. Selling south was a phrase that landed in the gut like a stone in still water. It meant the deeper plantations, the harder labor, the greater distance from whatever threadbare structures of community and familiarity a person had managed to build. It was a kind of living execution. Elias stood in the yard with the whole community watching. He looked at Bess, who had told him to be careful. He looked at Solomon, in whom he had watched something new and fragile grow over the past months. He looked at Thomas, the pragmatist, who had his arms crossed and his eyes on the ground. "I can't say it didn't happen," Elias said. His voice was not defiant. It was simply honest in the way that physical facts are honest. A tree does not defy gravity by standing. It simply does what it is. "I can say I might have been mistaken," he continued. "I can say that I'm a man, and men make mistakes. And maybe what I heard was my own heart talking. I can say all of that, but I can't say nothing happened when something happened." Hargrove sold him 3 days later. Elias was taken north on a Saturday morning, north to another county, to a plantation none of them knew anything about, except that it existed and was worse. He left with less than he had arrived with, which had itself been almost nothing. But something stayed behind. It was not a plan. Thomas had been right about that. It was never a plan. It was not an organization or a doctrine or a set of instructions. It was something more difficult to name and therefore more difficult to destroy. Solomon began to stand differently. He could not have explained exactly why, except that he had heard a man who owned nothing claim that he had been spoken to by the Creator of everything, and the man had said it not with the lunacy of desperation, but with the stillness of someone who had simply been in the presence of something real. That stillness had transferred. It lived now in Solomon's spine, in the particular angle of his chin, in the way he met the eyes of overseers just a half-second longer than was comfortable for them. Old Bess kept the story and told it to her granddaughter in the way she told her other essential things. The names of medicinal plants, the proper way to read weather, the location of the creek path that a person could follow north if they ever needed to. She placed the story of Elias in that category, not as a religious relic, but as a piece of practical knowledge. The knowledge that someone on this land had once been still enough to hear something, and had been honest enough not to deny what he had heard. Even Henry, the pragmatic man, carried something. He never spoke of it. But on certain mornings, alone, he would stop for just a moment before beginning his work. He would stand with his face slightly raised, not in imitation, not in mockery, but with something like attention, listening briefly to the architecture of his own experience, to the parts of it that lay beneath the measurable weight of labor and pain. Whether God had actually spoken to Elias was a question none of them could answer with certainty. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the value of what Elias carried was never in its verifiability. It was in the posture it required, the posture of a man who believes himself worth speaking to, who believes that his life, lived in these conditions, in this body, in this time, is still a life that the fundamental forces of existence might have something to say about. The plantation continued. The cotton grew and was picked and was baled and shipped and sold. The ledgers were maintained. The order of things persisted with the enormous grinding momentum that such orders always maintain. But something had shifted, by less than a degree, in the way that small shifts accumulate into earthquakes. Elias was gone. The story of Elias was not. And in the long accounting, in whatever ledger is more honest than the ones men keep, that may be the more significant fact.